Ogden. And also, you can tell I'm here in Ogden, Utah. Staff is featuring all the and also such as this, you could play freight cars. And you could learn about the transcontinental railroad here in Utah, in Ogden, Utah. So yeah, so you'll see me in some scenes where I'm in the state of Nebraska, where it was made, and also here in Ogden, Brigham City, and Promontory. You'll see me at and also met in Promontory is the Union Pacific started way out east, and the Union Central Pacific started in Sacramento in 1869, met in Promontory. So enjoy the video.
There were no tracks to get across America years ago, and the only way to get across America was horse-drawn carriages. So an engineer named Theodore Judah, who was an American railroad and civil engineer, had a dream of building a transcontinental railroad to get across the country. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln, who was a former railroad lawyer and the 16th President of the United States, signed the Pacific Railroad Act, and the country was in the middle of the Civil War, and the Civil War began in 1861 till 1865 when it ended. Also, groundbreaking started in Omaha in 1863 for the Union Pacific. A lot of things had to be imported from the East Coast. Every spike, rail, keg of black powder, and locomotive, and it would take 5 to 8 months to be shipped by sea to San Francisco and then carried to Sacramento. From San Francisco, everything had to be hauled up to the Sierra by horse or ox. The track lane crew followed the grader with track material. The rails, cross ties, spikes, bolts, and rail joint bars called fish plates, and 4 or 5 men would need to take off a 650-pound rail and drop it down. And once one rail was laid, a person with a track gauge with a piece of wood 4 foot 8.5 inches long came to measure the distance for measuring the second rail. Also, crew would lay the rail and drive the spikes in. Also, the Union Pacific would get the supplies from the neighboring eastern states. Also, there were no machines around in the 1860s, so people had to build the locomotives and rails and spikes and bridges all by hand. The idea of finding a route or building passage that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean dates back to first explorers of the American continent. At that time, there wasn't a passage that connected the two. It wasn't until some 500 years later that a passage was built. By the mid-1830s, the railroads in the eastern part of the United States had already transformed the people's way of life. However, at the end of the Civil War, the railroad still only stretched as far as the Missouri River. In 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act, which authorized 2 companies, the Central Pacific and Union Pacific, to build the first railroad across the West, The Central Pacific would push eastward from Sacramento, California over the Sierra Nevada mountains, and the Union Pacific would start at the Missouri River, pushing across the Great Plains and cutting through the Rockies. For a quarter of a century, man dreamt of building a line from coast to coast. Now they would attempt to build it. 1,775 miles of track would be laid, stretching from Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California. It would cut through mountains higher than any track builder ever faced, span deserts where there was no water, and cross treeless prairies where they would run into defiant Indians that would resist their passage. The staggering distance were too great and the risk too high for any businessman to invest his personal fortune. Because of this, each company would have to take out large loans from the U.S. Treasury. The United States government would also pay each company per mile track they laid. 16,000 per mile of level track they laid, 32,000 per mile of track laid in plateaus or foothill, 48,000 per mile of track laid in the mountains. Lobbyists for the railroad doubled these rates within years' times. Leland Stanford, governor of California and president of the Central Pacific Railroad, persuaded a prominent geologist by the name of Josiah Whitney to declare the gently sloping Sacramento Valley a mountainous region so the Central Pacific could collect the highest possible rate for laying track across it. A grateful California legislation named its highest peak Mount Whitney in the professor's honor. Congress also promised each company 6,400 acres of federal land for every mile of track they laid. Sacramento, California is where the Central Pacific started laying their first set of rails, and Sacramento is the capital of this state, of course, and also on January 8, 1863, the ground was broken in Sacramento for the eastbound section of track. Also, the starting point of the Central Pacific Railroad is where the California State Railroad Museum is. And most of the museum items can be found in this building you see right here, such as this 1914 19-inch gauge Pacific locomotive used on the Overfair Railway and seen on display in the museum's lobby. And also, you could even learn about the first transcontinental railroad of the nation and even see how the photographer took the pictures on how the railroad was being built from the past and such. You'll learn about the history of it. The museum even features these historic photographs you see in this picture right here. The museum even features the first steam locomotive on the Central Pacific Railroad when constructing, which is this locomotive, Central Pacific number 1, named Gov. Stanford, and because Leland Stanford was the president of the Central Pacific. And in front of it, it shows you how the snow sheds were built in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And also, this is a diorama they have of the ceremony of what it looked like in 1869. The museum also even features old toy trains, American Flyer, Bachmann, Lionel, and such, N gauge, O gauge, HO, and G scale, and a lot to see there. And in this glass case is a miniature locomotive And the museum has some miniature train cars and locomotives just like it. And the museum also features lots of steam engines, standard gauge and narrow gauge, and it doesn't just feature steam locomotives, it also features diesels and rolling stock, passenger cars and freight cars, and etc. And also, you could see the C.P. Huntington locomotive there, as well as the only surviving cab-forward locomotive, Southern Pacific 4294, and also features Virginia and Truckee number 12, the Genoa. In 1861, Judah convinced 4 Sacramento merchants, Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins, who come to be known as the Big Four, chartered the Central Pacific and chose a civil engineer from New York, Theodore Judah, to map a route east through the Sierras. The mountains seemed like impenetrable walls of rock, and to make matters worse, Charles Crocker, whose job it was to break through, met them, couldn't seem to hold on to his workers. 3 out of 5 workers stuck with the Central Pacific just long enough to get a free ride to the nearest railhead, where they then set off on their own for the gold and silver fields of Nevada. Crocker's plan called for a workforce of 5,000. He had fewer than 600 workers. Desperate, he suggested to his superintendent of construction, James Strobridge, that he try hiring Chinese workmen. The Chinese were barely making a living in America at that time. Most of them were working old, abandoned gold and silver mines. Strobridge was against the idea. He thought the Chinese were too frail for the type of labor building rails demanded. He also stated that he had no experience in building railroads. Crocker told Strobridge to give the Chinese a chance, pointing to the Great Wall of China as an example of what they were capable of. Before long, over 11,000 Chinese were at work on the Central Pacific Railroad. However, Crocker wanted more, so he started advertising all over China, bringing in more workers. Though the Chinese were hard workers, they were no match for the Sierra Nevada mountains. Strobridge had the manpower he needed, but the mountains would not budge. He started to worry that the Central Pacific was falling even further behind in the race with the Union Pacific. Strobridge began arming his workers with black powder to try and blast their way through. It took nearly 500 kegs a day after day, week after week, to carve through the foothills of the mountains. Once that was done, they came face to face with their biggest challenge yet, Cape Horn, a solid piece of rock which ran nearly straight up and down. To make matters worse, there was Ragging River that ran right by it, 2,000 feet below. There were no footholds on Cape Horn for the workmen, but the Chinese were told to make a ledge on the cliff wide enough for a train. Once again, the Chinese would prevail. They came up with a genius idea to tackle Cape Horn. They would lower the smallest workman they had over the side of the cliff in a basket. That person would then chisel a hole in the rock large enough for a powder keg. The keg was placed inside, fuse lit, and then the worker in the basket was pulled up. This was a daunting and dangerous task. Before the Central Pacific could get fully through the Sierra Nevadas, they would have to blast 15 tunnels through the mountains. They worked in shifts around the clock. However, all that effort only managed to average a staggering 8 inches a day through the mountains. During this time, the Chinese endured all types of weather conditions. The winters were especially bad in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Workmen were trapped in avalanches. Some froze to death, trapped in the snow. Sometimes the bodies could be recovered, and sometimes they would have to wait for the spring to thaw before they could even look for the bodies. No one kept a precise count of how many Chinese died digging and blasting their way through the mountains, but an estimate 1,200 brave Chinamen lost their life. Finally, in 1868, after 3 long years of digging and blasting, the Central Pacific work crews did what few believed anyone could do. They broke out of the high Sierra Nevada mountain range. The hardest part was now behind. The Central Pacific. They were back in the race. Thomas Durant provided the funds and the political favors for Union General Grenville Dodge, who was a Union Army officer on the frontier and pioneering figure in military intelligence during the Civil War, and who provided manpower to begin work on the Union Pacific. And he was an engineer and surveyor. The railroad came into Roseville on April 26, 1864, and also the town grew when the railroad had made its way into Roseville, California, and it was formerly known as Junction when Central Pacific was building the transcontinental railroad eastward from Sacramento. Also, the graders reached the town on November 29, 1863 that time. Also, just near the Union Pacific Yard features a Southern Pacific steam locomotive number 2252 and a rotary snowblower that's also from that railroad, number 7221, which they are just near the entrance to the downtown part. On June 6, 1864, the railroad had approached Rocklin, California, and the town became an important point in the building of the railroad. The area was rich in granite, a material the railroad needed for construction. Rocklin needed the railroad to transport granite produced in its quarries. In fact, Central Pacific's first paying freight was Rocklin granite. May 13, 1865, the railroad has reached Auburn, California. The railroad's arrival created a whole new section of the community. Due to the area's geography, the railroad was placed about a mile east of the major settlement at the time, Woods Dry Digging. The city expanded eastward and began to merge with older part of town and a new railroad depot. Also, in Auburn, you'll see it has the Gold Rush Museum located at an 1888 built train depot with a few refrigerator cars from the Chicago Northwestern, as well as a bay window caboose from the Southern Pacific. On September 1, 1865, the railroad had made its way into Colfax, California, and before it was known as Colfax, the railroad town was first called Alder Grove, and then later Illinois Town by a group of miners from Illinois. That would change with the Central Pacific Railroad's arrival. The Speaker of the House at the time, Schuyler Colfax, was sent by President Abraham Lincoln to check on check the progress of the tracks. So charmed were the citizens by his good cheer and oratory skills that they decided to name the settlement after him. Also in Colfax, you'll see that there is a passenger car on Railroad Street right across from the Amtrak depot, and it is numbered as Southern Pacific 1865 because that's the year the railroad came into town, and it was actually a Missouri, Kansas, Texas car. Also, just on Grass Valley and Main Street, there is a Southern Pacific caboose displayed there. Meanwhile, on April 9, 1865, America had finished fighting the Civil War and tore America apart, and the railroad was intended to unify America and bring it back together as one country. Also, it was intended to rebuild the economy by bringing the wealth of California into the Union. Meanwhile, Union Pacific started laying rails in Omaha, Nebraska. The first steam locomotive to be used on the Union Pacific line for the Transcontinental Railroad was the Major General Sherman, which was built by Danforth Cook of Paterson, New Jersey in 1864, and the 381st steam locomotive built by the factory. Also, immigrants who were brought in from Ireland to help build the Union Pacific Railroad, and working along the Irish and the Chinese were the freed slaves, and many of whom who fought for their freedom in the Civil War, and even they helped win the war. Many people thought of them as property less than human, and they worked together as one with teamwork. There was no time for rest on the Union Pacific. Speed was the key in beating the Central Pacific in the Great Race. In Nebraska, some 10,000 men were at work on the Union Pacific heading westward. Most were immigrants from Ireland, but there were also Mexicans, Germans, Englishmen, former slaves, and ex-soldiers of the Civil War. It was an army of workmen moving across the open prairie. A 20-car work train housed and fed the men who rose at dawn to begin their day of track building. A supply train would go out in front of the work train every day and carry all the supplies they needed for the day's work, including ties, rails, spikes, rods, and hand tools. I am here on 10th Street in Omaha, Nebraska, which is where Union Pacific laid their first set of rails. And also, here comes a freight train going by, if you can see. Yep. And also, right where the Missouri River is, as you can see, I don't know if you can see, but the Missouri River Bridge, where it crosses over to Council Bluffs, is where the Union Pacific laid their first set of rails. And right beside this bridge is the historic Union Station, which was built after the Transcontinental Railroad was built. And also today it serves as the Durham Museum. And if you ever visit the inside of it, you'll see it has an 1890s steam locomotive, number 1243, built in New Jersey, as well as a caboose behind it. Beside them, a trolley that was used here in Omaha, used on the Omaha and Council Bluffs Trolley Railway. As well as a sleeper car, and then a lounge car from Southern Pacific.
and the Cornhusker Club car. And it even features a model railroad beside the coaches. As you make your way up to Kennefic Park, you'll see this. This is a map of the original transcontinental railroad. You can see Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Promontory, Utah, where the last spike was driven on May 10, 1869, as well as Nevada and California, Sacramento, California, where the Central Pacific Railroad began laying its first set of rails. Omaha, Nebraska, which is where we are. I like how they made this cool-looking map right here. Okay, I'm also up here at the top of the Omaha welcome sign, which this is Kennefic Park, which has Union Pacific DDA 40X Centennial 6900, the first DDA 40X ever built, as well as the youngest surviving big boy locomotive, Union Pacific 4023, which was the second to last big boy ever built. Also, this park was created in 2005, some years after the original one got taken down because of the new event center in downtown Omaha, where the original one used to be. So you could come up here and experience. It's always free. Once it's free, it's always free. You don't have to pay admission to come up here, because as you're traveling on the highway going eastbound or westbound, which is down below, you get a good view of the trains up here, the locomotives, I should say. And also, I like how the welcome sign was made to welcome people to Omaha, as to use the big boy locomotive in DDA 40X Centennial, because Omaha has been the starting point for the Union Pacific Railroad building the Transcontinental Railroad. As you can see behind me, these are the tracks that are part of the original Transcontinental Railroad. And also, here in Omaha, Nebraska, and Pacific Preserve, just on Pacific and Bob Boozer Drive. And also, as I was saying, those tracks are part of the original Transcontinental Railroad. And also, as you can see here, are my cool items that are about it. Here are a few items I got from the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, when they had the original spikes on display there, as well as this book, and also this mugging cup right here, and this DVD of mine I had since like I was in 7th grade. And these books, this is a magazine from this year, it's good till June. The Undriving of the Golden Spike, which I got this year at the Ralston Arena train show, and Empire Express, building the first transcontinental railroad. And also, this is a metal plate that I ordered on Rebel Rails, and as well as that over there. These are my 10 scale models of the 119 Jupiter, which what they look like today, as well as this book. Hear that lonesome whistle blow. And these two puzzles that I haven't done yet, that I got from Joslin as well. one spike that I made by myself. Yeah. And also this book is by Stephen Ambrose. Nothing like it in the world. The man who built the Transcontinental Railroad from 1863 to 1869. And this book, of course, was illustrated by Chris Pete. It was a gift from him when he visited my elementary school when I was in 3rd grade. So Chris Pete, if you're watching this, I'd like to thank you again for the book you gave me. And he signed, Matthew, enjoy the books. Chris, 2004, Chris Pete. And yeah, and also this down below is something I made at home. What it's like, 150 years of the Transcontinental Railroad, and then driving on spike. That's the Jupiter 119, saying where they started, which is Union Pacific, started here in Omaha, and Central Pacific way out west in Sacramento. And the spike tells you where they met, Promontory, Utah, May 10, 1869. So yeah. And also, if you noticed my hat, I made it look nice for the 150th anniversary of the Gold Spike. On December 21, 1865, the railroad made its way through Valley, Nebraska, and also the Transcontinental Railroad was built, would be extended at that point, and also in 1864 the town of Valley was laid out, and also the town was named for the Platte River Valley. Also in Valley you'll find the Valley Community Historical Museum on Alexander Street. It features a big On January 24, 1866, the railroad soon came to Fremont, Nebraska, and the town was named after American explorer, politician, and military officer John C. Fremont. The tracks came to Fremont because it was important for as the railroad was. On May 3, 1866, the railroad soon approached Schuyler, Nebraska. Then, in 1870, originally the town was known as Shell Creek Station till 1870. It was renamed and named after Schuyler Colfax, who was the vice president under Ulysses S. Grant from 1869 to 1874. The town was the first town in western Nebraska town where cattle would be raised, would be loaded onto trains going east. And also here in Schuyler is Railside Green, which is displayed in the park as well. The best seat in the house to watch trains go by. On June 2nd, 1866, 36 miles of tracks were laid for Phase 2 of the Transcontinental Railroad. And also, the Columbus, Nebraska, and this site was chosen because of its location for the first transcontinental railroad. Also, here in Columbus, you'll find a 1901, a 1900s Baldwin steam engine at Pawnee Park, number 561. July 8, 1866, the railroad reached Grand Island, Nebraska. There were 98,000 tracks laid. Also, Grand Island has been a railroad center when the Pacific approached. Also, Grand Island is to US. You'll find the Stewart Museum that features a lot of historic memorabilia, as well as railroad memorabilia such as a 1900s Baldwin steam engine, 437 from the Union Pacific, and also a lot of historic rolling stock that are standard gauge and some narrow gauge, as well as just south of the place you'll even find next to a gas station, almost along I-80. October 1866, the railroad made its way into Kearney, Nebraska. And also, as the Civil War ended, the railroad was able to move westward. And in Kearney on 11th Street, you'll find the Trails and Rails Museum featuring a depot from Shelton, Nebraska, used by Union Pacific, and also features a 1900 On September 26, 1866, the railroad soon approached Lexington. Originally, the town was called Plum Creek until it was renamed Lexington in 1871. And also, there is a train-related attraction here in Lexington, which is at the Dawson County Museum, which is on North Taft Street. It's not just a train attraction, it's got other attractions you may experience, which it features a train depot from Willow Island, Nebraska, as well as a flat car and a Union Pacific steam engine built by Baldwin in the 1900s, and its number is 485. As you can see, these tracks behind me are actually part of the first transcontinental railroad that was built and came through here on its way to Promontory. On October 6, 1866, the railroad soon approached Cozad, Nebraska, and also John Cozad, who was a native of Ohio, was founded in 1873, and also John laid out his plans for the future town, and also tracks here are definitely part of the original transcontinental railroad, and also
On May 24, 1867, the Union Pacific Railroad had reached the town of Ogallala, and the town got its name from the Ogallala Lakota earlier inhabitants of this region. Among the first visitors to this part of Nebraska were trappers from St. Louis. The next were the folks who followed the Oregon Trail. Union Pacific came through and the settlement of Ogallala began in earnest. Settlers started to follow the railroad west, and cattlemen started driving their cattle to Ogallala to be shipped east or to be sold to Montana or Wyoming ranchers. Also, at Front Street Mall, there is a wooden caboose from the Union Pacific on display. The railroad then came into Julesburg, Colorado on June 24, 1867, and the Sand Creek Massacre of Cheyenne and Arapaho occurred on November 29, 1864, caused a large number of Indians on the Kansas and Colorado Great Plains to intensify hostilities against the U.S. Army and white settlers and the entire town of Julesburg was burnt to the ground, and also the first town of Old Julesburg was named after Jules Benny, who established a trading post near where Lodgepole Creek enters the South Platte River on the old overland stage route. Also, just near US 385, it has a former Union Pacific caboose displayed there. On August 10, 1867, the railroad had reached Sidney, Nebraska, and the city was named for Sidney Dillon, a Union Pacific employee who rose to become company president in 1874. The military established Sidney Barracks on December 12, 1867. The barracks were a sub-post of Fort Sedgwick, located in the Colorado Territory, and the town was officially incorporated on October 8, 1884. Also in Sidney at Legion Park features a Union Pacific steam locomotive as well as a Sidney low boxcar and a caboose from Northern Pacific in Burlington Northern, and also just on near Old Post Road on Glover Road has a visitors center featuring outside a Union Pacific caboose, as well as inside the visitors center has model trains and some glass cases. Then on August 29, 1867, the railroad had reached Kimball, Nebraska, and followed by settlers who began to call the town home. Also in Kimball, you'll find a museum called the Plains Historical Museum, and it even features a Union Pacific caboose there. On November 13, 1867, the railroad had reached Cheyenne, Wyoming, and also Cheyenne began as part of the homeland for the indigenous Cheyenne tribe and was an early campsite for the U.S. Army. In 1865, U.S. Army Major General Grenville Dodge and his troops were charged with finding a railroad route over the Laramie Mountains. 2 years later, he became the chief engineer for the Union Pacific Railroad and established as a terminal town there. He named it Cheyenne after a local area tribe. Also, Cheyenne is the capital of Wyoming. In Cheyenne, you can find a caboose in Clear Creek Park from the Union Pacific Railroad, and it is just near I-80. And also in Holiday Park features a Union Pacific Big Boy locomotive number 4004. And Cheyenne was once home to the famous Union Pacific Big Boy locomotives, all 25 of them that were built. And over in Lions Park has another surviving Union Pacific 460, number 1242. Also, it has the historic Cheyenne Depot, which is just across the tracks from the depot is the Roundhouse, which is where the steam program is. Then the Dale Creek Trestle was completed in 1868, and it was the longest bridge on the Union Pacific Railroad and reached 150 feet above Dale Creek. In 1901, it was dismantled, and in 1876 was replaced by an iron spiderweb bridge manufactured by American Bridge Company in Chicago, and Union Pacific completed construction of a new alignment over Sherman Hill. The town of Sherman was named for William T. Sherman, purportedly at his own request. It was located about 7.5 miles south-southeast of the modern Sherman Summit and was the highest point on the original alignment of the first transcontinental railroad of the Union Pacific Railroad. Several people lived in Sherman, hunkered down upon a rocky, barren landscape, interrupted only by a general store, post office, schoolhouse, 2 hotels, the Sherman House and the Summit House, and 2 saloons. In 1918, it was a sad day for Sherman, and the railroad closed the station house and relocated the tracks 3 miles south. Some of the remains of Sherman is the roundhouse with the pit with some of the bricks still inside the dirt, and the Ames Monument, and sadly no foundations or buildings remain. In the spring of 1868, the Sierra Nevadas were finally conquered by the Central Pacific Railroad, after almost 5 years of sustained construction effort by mainly Chinese laborers, with the successful completion at Donner Pass of its 1,659-foot tunnel, which is Tunnel 6. On April 3, 1868, the railroad soon made its way into Truckee, California, and also in 1863 the town was known as Gary's Station, which it was named for Joseph Gary's Roadhouse on the Trans-Sierra Wagon Road. A blacksmith named Samuel S. Coburn and was there almost from the beginning, and by 1866 the area was known as Coburn Station. The Central Pacific Railroad selected Truckee as the name of its railroad station by August 1867, and the railroad didn't reach the station till April 1868. In Truckee, you'll find at the historic depot a Southern Pacific Bay window caboose, which you see in the photo. Still building the railroad, it sounded like an anvil chorus. 3 strokes to the spike, 10 spikes to the rail, and 400 rails to the mile, all the way over the Sierras. And at last the railroad had entered Nevada. On June 7, 1868, the railroad has made its way up to Laramie, Wyoming, and the Union Pacific was making plans to have its tracks run across the Laramie Plains as early as 1864. The railroad went up and over the mountains from Cheyenne and reached Laramie on May 4, 1868. Scheduled passenger service soon followed on June 7. The town was named for Jacques Laramie, who was a French-Canadian trapper for the American Fur Company and a mountain man who lived in what is now the state of Wyoming. Having settled there in 1815, he died in 1921 and the town was named after him. Also, in Laramie, it has the historic Union Pacific Depot, and it has 4 historic Union Pacific equipment displayed near it, such as a snowplow, followed by a 1900s Baldwin-built steam locomotive, and a bunk car, and a caboose. In June of 1868, the railroad had reached Sparks, Nevada, and when Southern Pacific Railroad succeeded Central Pacific as the new owner of the main line across northern Nevada, it decided to realign the tracks, and the new route bypassed the town of Wadsworth, Nevada, which for 40 years had controlled the roundhouse and maintenance facilities of the Central Pacific. Over in Lillard Park, it has a museum with a narrow-gauge Southern Pacific steam locomotive, as well as 3 standard-gauge pieces from that railroad, as well as a bay window caboose and cupola caboose, and a business car and a replica depot. On August 8, 1868, the railroad came into Rawlins, Wyoming, and the railroad gave names to places as it laid its tracks westward, and Civil War General John Aaron Rawlins was put in charge of protecting the crew, surveying the route. According to the history of Rawlins, the general asked for a drink of good cold water. His men explored the countryside and came upon a spring. Grenville Dodge named the water source Rawlins Springs, and the community that formed around it bore the same name, and the Union Pacific came through Rawlins Springs on its way west. The town became a distribution and supply point for extensive oil and gas fields, sheep and cattle ranches, coal mines and quarries, and also the name of the town was shortened and renamed Rawlins. Also, in this picture, in Rawlins, you'll find at the former Union Pacific Depot built in 1901 and has a caboose next to it, and also on Bennett and Davis is Rawlins Spring Park and has a former bay window caboose, and also at Tully Park it has a Baldwin 280 number 533, and all these pieces were used by the Union Pacific Railroad. In August 1868, the railroad had reached Rock Springs, Wyoming, and the town was founded in 1850 when the federal government established an overland station near a large spring flowing from the rocks, and then, 18 years later, the railroad had approached the town of Rock Springs, and because of scarcity of wood on the Union Pacific system, the railroad needed an alternative source of energy to run trains. Since coal was abundant in Rock Springs, Union Pacific developed the mines there to feed its locomotives. Also in Rock Springs, Wyoming, there is a historic train depot that is used as a coffee shop these days. And next to the depot is a former Union Pacific caboose, as well as nearby it, outside the depot, has some mining memorabilia. Then, on October 1st, 1868, the railroad approached Green River, Wyoming, and during that time the town was incorporated. Also, Union Pacific's impact on Green River was huge, but in its earliest days, far from certain. The railroad originally planned to build a switching station, including a railroad yard and roundhouse, at the town site, but chose instead to establish the switching point 13 miles west in Bryan, Wyoming, near the Black's Fork of Green River. Also, in Evers Park in Green River has a former Union Pacific caboose. Then the railroad made its way to Evanston on December 4, 1867, and as the railroad came through the town, Chief Engineer Grenville Dodge decided to name it after James A. Evans, who you see in this picture right here, who was the surveyor who marked the eastern half of the railroad's route through Wyoming. In the town of Evanston, in the park on Elm and Oak Street near North Evanston Elementary School, it has a former Union Pacific 060 switch engine built in 1914 by Lima, and number is 4420, and along with it in the park features a boxcar that may have been used by the Union Pacific. And also, just on Union Drive has the historic Evanston Roundhouse that is used as an event center today. And you could tell by these pictures, it's having some renovations presently. On January 25, 1869, the railroad soon approached Elko, and also the rails came through on Christmas Eve that year and was established in 1868. And the arrival of the railroad also provided Elko a year-round connection with the outside world, and Charles Crocker likely named the town. Also in Elko, there is a small railroad park on 7th and Railroad Street with two former Western Pacific pieces, which is Electromotive Diesel 727 and Bay Window Caboose 437.
On March 7, 1869, the railroad came into Ogden, Utah. And also, Ogden was a small settlement and was a Mormon, purchased with a small settlement with a fort. And the town was originally named Brownsville until 1852, honoring Peter's King Ogden. It was renamed Ogden, Utah. So here in Ogden, Utah, you can see the Union Station right behind me. The rail display as well. And Ogden was a railroad town. Also, a huge variety of trains on display at the Union Station. Also, the town was honored for Brigham City, Brigham Young. In 1869, the railroad soon came up to Brigham City, and the town was named for Brigham Young in 1867. And also, it was on soon on 27, 1869. And also here in Brigham City, you find this yellow bay window
On April 28, 1869, 10 miles of rails were laid all in one day by the Union Pacific Railroad. Then the railroads both met in Promontory, Utah, but what happened was grading crew would just pass each other, but it wasn't till later that the federal government told both railroad companies where to meet. So instead of debating of who got to Promontory first, President Ulysses S. Grant decided that the Union Pacific and Central Pacific should meet in Promontory. So two locomotives had been chosen, which was the 119 for Union Pacific, and the Jupiter wasn't chosen originally for the Central Pacific, but the Antelope was chosen until it ran into a problem, which got struck by a log, and then the Jupiter took over. Leland Stanford's office car was built in 1868 by the Central Pacific shops in Sacramento, California, and it was added to the train, which it is Central Pacific 25, and later was sold to Virginia and Truckee, and today it is still preserved today and belongs to the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Carson City, Nevada.